Good evening. Good to see all of you here tonight. Some new faces, and I really enjoyed last night being with everybody. It was just a true joy for me to be here. Some of you have been very complimentary tonight about what you've learned from last night, and I hope that that's the case. As we get started, we think about moving beyond our loss, and I want to just start by saying that in the course of time, as we mark time, we have a Easter weekend up, so everybody is thinking about the death of Christ and what happens in the resurrection of Christ. But there's a certain mark here, right, where before this time, we mark time as being what? Before Christ, right? And AD is not after death, but it's some Latin term that means in the year of our Lord. And so I want you to pardon me?
Anno Domini.
There you go, Anno Domini. So I want you to understand that it's very real. I mean, this is permeating our culture, that we mark things based on loss. We mark things based on historical events. How many in here have ever celebrated a birthday? Let me see your hands. Okay, I'm not going to ask how many. I'm just wanting to see if you're awake. All right, so you celebrated a birthday. We mark time by the events of our life. We also mark time by the events of the deaths in our life. My dad died 14 years ago in January of 1999, on about January the 7th, I think is the date. I was up in Kentucky last week, and I went by and visited his grave a couple of times because it was not far from where I was going. It's right there on the marker. It tells about that. We mark time. But something's happened in the 14 years since he died. Something's happened in the 2,000 plus years that happened after Jesus died. The earth still spins. The sun still rises. The rivers still flow. Winter still comes, and so does spring. Babies are still born. People still marry. We get hungry. We get happy. We get sad. Somehow or another, through all the course of human history, we have learned, individually and as societies, to move beyond our loss. So not to minimize the memory of anybody that we've lost, not to minimize the loss of anything that we've encountered in the course of friends, or in the course, there's that spot again, in the course of friends, or in the course of losing a job or anything else. But we learn to adapt and we learn to move on. And that's what we want to talk about tonight. There are 3 questions that are here on your handout. You might want to mark down some of these answers as we go along. I, of course, have the teacher's version. My answers are already written in. If Matthew was like some of my friends that I went to college with, my Bible would be somewhere up in the balcony and the sheets would be somewhere shredded, just as a course of showing how much he loves me. Matthew, I'm glad that you don't love me that much to make my life difficult for this. But the first question is, will I ever laugh again? Will I ever laugh again? Sometimes I make odd movie references. Who in here remembers the movie It's a Mad, 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 Mad World? You need to get that movie, Matthew. It's a 4-hour-long movie. It's a movie that even on the DVD has the intermission built in, okay? But it's got a who's who of everybody that was back in the 60s. I mean, they've got cameo appearances by all kinds of people, but there's a section in there. Spencer Tracy is a guy, and he's the policeman, and I'm not going to give away the whole movie, but anyway, at the end, he's guilty of doing things. Everybody's laid up in the hospital. He's in a body cast. Everybody's there. And he's saying, if I could just find the way to smile again at some point in my life. And then Ethel Merman comes in. She slips on a banana peel. She's not a nice lady in the movie. And she falls down on her backside. And everybody erupts in laughter. And eventually Spencer Tracy does too. Here he is. Here's the point. Here he is. He thinks he's going to live the rest of his life and never smile again, never laugh again, never enjoy another moment because I have really messed up. And yet it wasn't but just a moment later he found himself joining others in laughter. Do you know how odd people feel sometimes at the funeral home when there's laughter that's going on? Funeral homes are where I see most of my relatives now. The extended relatives, all my dad's cousins, all my mom's aunts and uncles and nephews and all of these types of things. The funeral home is where we normally get together. There are 2 of my dad's cousins that work for a funeral home up in Paducah, Kentucky. And anytime I go up to do a funeral, when I lived up in that area, I'd always see Jackie and Marilyn, and we'd cut up in some way. We'd have to, after a while. But, we were laughing there. It took me several years to get to the point where I realized it's okay to be in that setting and still enjoy the company around us, because the person that's dead, the funeral's not for that person. The funeral is for us, the people that remain. And it's good for us to have this support. Will I ever laugh again? Yes. Will I ever be happy again? Yes, I think you will. I think you will find the time to be happy. I think you will find the time where it's time to laugh again. Will the pain ever go away? Yes, I think the pain is going to go away. Will I ever get over the loss that I've suffered? Well, I don't particularly like the term get over. You know, somebody says get over it. You know, a father to his son who's crying over the puppy dog that died, and he says, son, just get over it. It's not very encouraging. Somebody that's well-meaning that tells you after the loss of your employment or the loss of your spouse, and they say, you just need to get over it. Well, that's not very fulfilling. But will I ever be to the point where the pain can go away? Yes, I think you can be. I think you can get to the point where you accept the loss that you've had, you've worked through it, you complete that loss in a healthy way, and you can live to enjoy life. Now, sometimes when we go through life with our losses, we're going to be challenged by people who come up to us and say, how are you doing? How are you doing? And what's our typical response? I'm fine. That's what we expect in our culture, right? If you go up to somebody and you ask them one time, how are you doing? And 30 minutes later they finish telling you how they're doing, guess what happens the next time you see that person? You know, I'm going to go the other way maybe, or I'm going to say, hey, how about those Titans or something? I'm not going to ask the question again, how are you doing? Because I don't have time for that. You know, and see, that's how our culture is. We say this as a part of our course, like good morning, how are you, goodbye. In most cases, we really don't want to know how the person's doing. And therefore, the person that's hurting and grieving, they feel that pressure. And so they want to give the answer that society wants them to have. And that's why we come into Academy Award performances. And that's the next thing here on our... I just can't walk that way. That's the next thing on our list, Academy Award performances. Only about 20% of our communication is verbal. 80% of our communication is nonverbal. I can demonstrate in a few ways. One way is this. Our nonverbal communication says a lot. If Matthew's talking to me and I'm like this the whole time, you know, I'm saying, yes, that's very interesting. Mm-hmm, yeah, right. I mean, you know, tone and inflection. Well, I don't know. You were talking last night about it. You were dying, you know, in your sermon. And so I
sounded excited about that.
I know. But anyway, well, actually, I knew a preacher in Kentucky that was getting ready to preach. He was standing up the song before he got up to preach. Rob Key was his name. He preached at Spring Creek, where my dad is buried. My mom's family years ago gave the land for all that. And Rob Key he had a lot of health problems, and his brother-in-law, who he had been studying with to be a Christian, was in the audience with him, and he's standing up on the second pew, and they're singing the song before the sermon, and he has a heart attack and dies right there. So it does happen. Oh, I'm sorry, that was kind of a downer, wasn't it? Okay, well, let's get back to the other thing. So that's what happens when you let me get off track. You know, the thing, I saw one of their elders, he came over to the meeting where I was last week, and we were talking about different things, and they had another preacher, and he had some health concerns as well. The preacher before them had a stroke while he was there, and I was afraid to ask who they were going to hire for the next preacher, because I was like, do I warn him? You know, do I let him know it's a dangerous place to work? You know, they ought to have an OSHA requirement up there on the wall. But here we go, you know, the Academy Award performance. We want to show what everybody wants to see because we want to be accepted. We want to have support from people. And if I am 6 weeks after a loss, if I've been 2 months and I can't find a job, if I'm still grieving because I'm a widow and my 14-year-old Chihuahua died and nobody wants to hear, nobody understands how much that dog meant to me, what happens is I tend to keep giving these Academy Award performances. Every time you see me and ask me how I'm doing, I'm going to say, I'm fine. What can I do for you? Oh, nothing. I've got it all under control. Are you sure you know how to do all the things to winterize the house and to get all the bills paid? Oh, honey, I've got it covered. It's no problem. You see, we put up this front because society has taught us that everybody deals with this rather quickly. We don't really need the help. Do you remember what the 3 C's are for the first 2 weeks after grieving? What's the first one? Cards. What's the second one? condolences, and casseroles. That's right. Hey, y'all are good. This is wonderful. Yeah, I should give you a test before the end of the time. When we have the nonverbal communication, you can tell when a person's not feeling well, can't you? You can look at them and say, that person's just not feeling well. When they're saying I'm fine, but when other signals are showing that they're not, that's the Academy Award performance. When you watch them when they get out of the car coming up to the church building, and if they're different that way than as when they see somebody in the foyer, that's an Academy Award performance. Open our eyes, look around, watch the nonverbal as well, and help the person to understand it's okay to grieve, it's okay to have emotion, it's okay to struggle, and God has put us here to help support one another. Remember in 1 Corinthians chapter 12, there's a whole passage there where Paul talks about the body of Christ is just like the body that we have physically. And we can't all be hands or eyes or ears, but we work together in unison. And so during that passage he says, when one suffers, we all suffer. When one rejoices, we all rejoice. And so that's what we need to think of each other as we're going along. What about Romans 8 and verse 28? There's a verse there that's been used a lot. I used to use this when I went to see people who were terminally ill or see the family after death. And I would just lay this out because it's Scripture and it's true, but it's not always helpful. And we know that all things work together for good to those that love God, to those who are called according to His purpose. Do you know how hollow that sounds to a person who's just lost their son in an automobile accident? If you say to them, you know, everything's going to work out. You love God, he loved God. It's all going to be all right. Glad I could be of help. See you tomorrow. That's not very helpful. It's not very helpful. It can be true, but it's not very helpful. If I come back up here to this timeline and I can see not the BC and AD, but I'm going to have a loss right here, right? So this is my loss. Before the loss, I'm feeling happy. I'm up here. After the loss, I'm down here. Later on, I might be improved along the line, but at the moment of my loss, you can't possibly tell me, since I've gone from there all the way down to here, you can't possibly tell me here everything's going to be okay and it have a good effect on me. It might well improve, but it might take a lot of time. It might be that the loss has got me so depressed and so under that the unhelpful things that are said to me may cause me to be down here even longer, because I know now that the expectation is for me to be better, and I'm not better at this point. Well, let's take a few moments here and think about Romans 8:28. It's not always helpful because it's true, but usually it's true as you look back on history. I mentioned last night about the footprints in the sand. And as you see that poem and as you see those, two sets of footprints, but during my difficult days, God, there was only one. Why did you abandon me? And the answer came back, I didn't abandon you. That's when I was carrying you. Okay? When we look back on the darker times of our life, whatever loss that we've encountered, whatever struggle that we've encountered, we can see things working out, but usually we don't see them in the moment working out. I believe in the providence of God. Do you? I believe in good luck and bad luck as well. I believe in good preparation. I was a Boy Scout for 1 year. Okay, they didn't have a lot of interest in Boy Scouts in Western Kentucky when I grew up, so we had Weeblos for 1 year. That was it. So I know something about, duct tape and a pocket knife and get the MacGyver DVDs, and you can do all this stuff, right? But I know Boy Scouts were supposed to be prepared. So I know that if you plan ahead, if you prepare for things, then you can avoid a lot of emergencies. I also know that at times things just seem to work out, and we call that providential. We even use it as an excuse sometimes when it rains or something. We might say that we've been providentially hindered from coming out, because of things. Sometimes things do work out, but you never really see it in the moment. Let's say, for example, you're getting ready to go to work or go to church in the morning, and you're delayed by a train crossing, or you're delayed by somebody who's had a wreck, and all of a sudden then you realize that 10 minutes later when you get to the interstate, there's been a horrific accident. And you start to think and you start to play back in your mind, if I had left on time, if I hadn't been delayed at that stoplight, if I hadn't had to wait for that school bus, I would have been there when that semi-truck went over and killed that other person. And you start to think, well, all of the things that were wrong that I thought about, all of the things that caused me to be mad at the time may have been the very things that were helping me to be preserved later on. You never know how things are going to work out in the moment. That's why Romans 8:28 isn't always helpful. But looking back, you can look at things and see that so many of these things work out because that's how we're going to be helped. Let's turn over to 2 Samuel chapter 12 for a moment. Let's look at David and some of his losses here. When David is being confronted by Nathan, you remember this story. This is after David and Bathsheba have had their affair, and Uriah was killed as a part of that. David had lied, he conspired, finally he conspired for murder. And Nathan approaches David and outs him. He tells his parable. David is just angered because of the parable. He pronounces judgment, and then this famous line where Nathan says, "You are the man, all right? You're the one that's guilty." Well, as a result of all that, his son is going to die. His son is going to die. Well, he doesn't want his son to die. This is a man after God's own heart. He doesn't want his son to die. And so the Lord struck the child that Uriah's wife bore to David, and it became ill. That's in verse 15. And so therefore David pleaded with God for the child, and David fasted and went in and lay all night on the ground. All this happens, and it happens on for days. But then he hears the servants whispering in verse 19, and David perceived that the child was dead. Therefore David said to his servants, "Is the child dead?" And they said, "He is dead." So David arose from the ground, he washed and anointed himself and changed his clothes, and he went out into the house of the Lord to worship. And then he went to his own house, and when he requested, they set food before him, and he ate. Then his servants said to him, What is it that you've done? You fasted and wept for the child while he was alive, but when the child died, you arose and ate food. And David said, While the child was alive, I fasted and wept. For I said, Who can tell whether the Lord will be gracious to me, that the child may live? But now that he is dead, why should I fast? Can I bring him back again? I shall go to him, but he shall not return to me. That passage is used a lot of times at funerals because we're talking about the finality of our human existence. And we can't bring this person back, but we have the hope of going to them. For those of us that have our faith in God, we know that that's true. But this is a form of grieving. This is a form of grieving when David knows that the loss is here. He's pleading with God. He doesn't know if God is going to answer. And once the child is dead, he ends that part of his grieving. He still grieves for the child, but in different ways. In 1 Samuel chapter 1, we have the example of Hannah. And you know that Hannah was grieved because she was barren. She wasn't able to have children. And so in 1 Samuel chapter 1, she goes and she's praying. And they think that Eli looks at her and thinks that she's crazy. But in verse 16, look at what she says. She says, "Do not consider your maidservant a wicked woman, for out of the abundance of my complaint and grief I have spoken until now." There was great grief within her. She had not suffered the loss of a child, but she had suffered the loss because she was not able to have a child. There are all kinds of losses that we encounter in life, and that was a grief that became unbearable for her, and she pleaded with God. Look at the book of Job. I love the book of Job for what it can teach us. I am driven to Job from time to time, as I'm sure that many of you are, when we face difficulties in our own life, and I never enjoy being driven to Job, but I know that Job holds so many answers, and I can't learn them all in one experience in life. Many times as I grow older and I have loss, I can look back to Job and I can see his struggles. I can find strength in what he says. In chapter 6, verses 2 and 3, he's really struggling here. You know, the friends that came, Eliphaz, Zophar, and Bildad, they've come to comfort him. But after the first week of sitting there and not saying a word, they didn't really provide any comfort. Instead, they turned the tables and they said, "Job, you're the one that's guilty. You've brought this on your own." You know, sometimes when people have a loss in their life, they really take on the guilt themselves. Okay? They really do. And Job knows that it's not just. I've not done anything to deserve this. But he says, "Oh, that my grief were fully weighed, and my calamity laid with it on the scales, then it would be heavier than the sand of the sea. Therefore my words have been rash." he's saying, do you realize just the grief that I'm encountering at this time? So much of this. You remember what happened with Job? You know, the first day, 4 different servants came in, and the literary is pretty striking, because the first one comes in and says, all of these things happened, and I alone have survived to tell you. And while he was still speaking, the second one comes in, and all of these things have been taken away, and everyone else died, but I alone have survived to tell you. And while he was still speaking, the third one came in. And then while he was still speaking, the fourth one came in with the most damaging news: all 10 of your children have been killed. Job, at that point in his life, he had fallen from a very prosperous man to a man who had no holdings. All of his 10 children were killed. All he was left with basically was his health, his wife, and 4 servants. His health is taken away from him in short order. His wife turns on him and says, curse God and die. We don't know what happened to the 4 servants, but the 3 friends plus the other friend that came kind of took their place, and they weren't very helpful. So if you've ever felt alone in your struggles, if you've ever felt like everything is going against you, read the book of Job. Begin to understand what he went through, and understand that God allowed that to happen, knowing his level of righteousness and knowing that he was going to struggle. When we as Christians think that God's going to protect me from any harm or from any struggle, we're shortchanging ourselves on what's possible. How many in here remember reading about the emperor moth and how the moth comes out? Emperor moth, anybody? Okay. Moths and butterflies, they start out as caterpillars. You know that, right? And then they form this little cocoon around them, this chrysalis, and then they're in there, and then they go through this metamorphosis. And while they're in the chrysalis, the metamorphosis takes place, and the caterpillar turns into a butterfly or a moth. This one man was studying these, and he saw this one moth that was really struggling, just a little bit of activity, but could not get through, could not break through. So in an effort to help, he took a pair of snips, and he snipped open a little slit so that the wings could come through. But that moth, when it came out, was kind of limped a little bit and stuff, and finally died, and never did get to where it could fly. We found out why. So he's a scientist. He's going to experiment with this. So he found out why. While that moth is still inside the chrysalis, everything's really tightly packed, and all of its body weight, all of its fluids are still in the main body, and it's not in the extremities of the wings. What happens was the struggle is part of God's design for that moth. If the moth doesn't struggle, the blood is never pumped into the areas of its wings, and it will never fly, and it will not survive. The struggle to come through, what the scientist thought he was doing to help to make it easy for that butterfly to come out, that moth to come out, was actually a death sentence for it, because it had to go through that struggle. It had to find a way on its own to strain and strain and strain, and then to push itself through this small opening. In doing so, that forced the fluids out of its body and into its wings to where it could take to flight pretty soon afterwards. Now, if God put that design in for a caterpillar to become a moth, and if God took this insect and said, you're going to have to struggle before you can get to the next level, how much more so do you think God looks upon us and the struggles that we have to say there are some things you're just going to have to face as we go on? Well, how do we express our grief, and can we complete it, or does it stay with us? We can express our grief in a lot of different ways. We need to express it in a healthy way. First of all, we need to be honest with people. If we're not fine when people ask us, how are you doing? Well, I'm dealing with as much as I can, but honestly, I don't know what I'm doing. That's a good, honest answer. Or you could say, I'm doing reasonably well, but I still miss my husband so much, and I cry myself to bed every night. You can do something with that as friends, rather than just hearing I'm fine and saying, whew, I'm glad she didn't tell me all the medicine she's taking. I didn't have time to hear about how the neighbor's dog comes over in her yard. I didn't have time to hear all this. No. See, if somebody says, I have this specific thing I'm wrestling with. It's time for an oil change, and George always did that, and I just don't know where he went. I don't know how to do things. When somebody is honest with what they're struggling with at the moment, there are ways, doors get opened, and you can walk right in and help. Where my grandmother used to go to a church in Paducah, Kentucky, they had squadron, if you will, a platoon of retired guys. And they were electricians and plumbers and carpenters and all kinds of handymen. And anytime one of the older ladies or older gentlemen at church had a problem, or if her pilot light went out on her oven, she called the church. And they would send somebody out to light her pilot light, because an 87-year-old lady doesn't need to be lighting her own pilot light. And when the air conditioning needs servicing again, they would send somebody out. If they couldn't do it, they would stay there while the service guy came, because 87-year-old ladies, sometimes they get the wool pulled over their eyes. Do you know what a great assurance that was to all the ladies in that congregation, and the older men as well? They didn't have to worry about getting a chair to change the light bulb. They called up to the church office, and they knew that somebody was happy to come and serve them. You see, they created a climate where it's okay to say, I need some help. They created the environment where it was okay to say, I can't do everything, and I really do need somebody to help. And everyone embraced that. Well, let's look a little bit at something else here called the lost pot. And I've got a little bit of time to draw this. If you promise not to laugh, right? You promise not to laugh. Never. Well, I've already messed up. Okay. What are you doing? What are you doing? All right, let's see. It's like this, and a little thing up there, a little thing up there. Okay. This is a pot. Okay. I didn't know if you knew that or not, but this is a pot. And what happens in life is we have a lot of unresolved, that's the next word there, unresolved issues that stay with us. Now, how many ladies in here have a pressure cooker at home? What's that little thing that goes on the top called? It's the what? Gauge? I just called it a jiggler. I didn't know what it was. I mean, if there's a real name to it, I don't know. It's just called the jiggler, My mom had 2 or 3 of them, because, you keep the jiggler when the rest of the pot goes. You put it, the jigglers can fit on any pot, right? But the jiggler's on top, right? The steam comes out at the top. It's a pressure cooker, so you put the potatoes in or whatever it is that you're cooking. It helps the cooking to go faster, and the pressure builds up. If there's not some way for the pressure to get out, though, at times, the pot eventually would do what? Yeah, it would explode. Well, guess what? We're going to talk about our lost pot. This is our lost pot. What happens with unresolved issues is we keep this inside of ourselves. We suppress some things. For example, there was that time back in kindergarten where that girl pushed you down in the playground, and you were afraid to tell anybody else, but then you were afraid of blonde-headed girls for 6 years after that. Right? That becomes an unresolved issue in your life. There was the time that you forgot all about the homework in the 3rd grade, and the teacher gave you a 0. There was the other time over here and here. What happens is all these things, if we don't deal with them, they start to accumulate in our lost pot. We never turn loose of those. Have you ever had somebody in your life that just knew how to push your buttons and make you angry? Okay. Have you ever known somebody that just made a sport out of making your life miserable? Maybe they would untie your shoe, or maybe they would do something else just to make you angry, okay? Maybe they thought it was funny, but after a while you didn't. If you never confronted them, if you never worked through that issue, this goes in your lost pot. Every time that person's name is mentioned, you start to bubble up a little bit, right? Well, as we go on through life, we get a lot more of these things happen. Then we get into puberty in high school, and then we get, this girlfriend, well, she didn't do me right, and then this best friend's not my best friend anymore. And then there was that time that Officer Bell pulled me over for speeding, and honest, he was already off work, and I was off work. We were both going to our homes. There was no reason for him to stop me and give me a ticket within sight of my mom and dad's house. Happened to me, Officer Bell, Kentucky State Trooper and stuff. And I just knew I was dead. I just knew that I was caught, because here he was. He pulled me over. The lights are flashing. I can see them flashing off of my mom and dad's house. We're right here at this crossroads. The church is there. Mom and dad's house is here. And I just know they're out on the porch watching me get this ticket. I don't have time to get a story or anything. I just have to walk in and be honest and just confess right there. That's my best course of action. So that's what I decided to do. Officer Bell, no warning. I mean, he knows me. No warning. It's my first time to be pulled over. He says, no, you were going fast. And I'm like, you kept up with me, Write yourself a ticket, I didn't say that, but I sure thought it, So he gives me this ticket. I drive, the equivalent of, 200 yards or whatever, or 100 yards, and then I'm in my driveway. I walk in. I say, well, I guess by now I got caught. And they're like, what are you talking about? And I look, there's these heavy drapes, they're drawn. You know, they've been watching Bonanza. I don't know what they've been doing. All right? But I fessed up, right? Well, I didn't resolve that with Officer Bell for a while. You know, I just, you know, kind of, every time I'd see him, I'm, yeah, okay. No, go get some real criminals, not me, you know. See what happens? These things keep going. Your first job, and somebody, you get passed over for a promotion. Somebody doesn't let you be a deacon at church, you know. Somebody else doesn't do this. What's happening here, right? Our pot's starting to fill up. Our pot's starting to fill up. Now, there's some other things that happen, all right? All right, we got this thing called a lid that comes on it too. This is a lid. I know you can't really tell that. But don't feel bad is one of the things that's listed there. Don't feel bad is something that people say to us. And when we're trying to deal with these issues, they say, don't feel bad, and we put the lid on it. Here's another one, be strong. Right? I want to cry my eyes out. I want to be able to be emotional and let people know that I really miss this person, or I really was disappointed not to get that job promotion, or whatever it might be. And somebody comes up to me and says, oh, don't cry. You've got to be strong. Well, what does that do to me? It puts the lid on my losses again, and it makes life pretty difficult for me. Or I've got to also replace the loss. E-A-C-E. Okay? Your dog died. Don't worry, Saturday we'll go get you a new one. You know, your girlfriend jilted you. Don't worry, there are more what? Fish in the sea. See, the guy didn't even know he was dating a fish, you know, but more fish in the sea. What sense does that make? I mean, my heart is broken and you're telling me something about, you know, fish. It doesn't make sense. But when they say these things, oh, that's all right. You know, you can get another job. You can have another child. You need to be strong for your mom. You need to be, don't feel bad. All of these things cause us to put the lid on our lost pot. Now, what happens? I'm going to try to use as many of these as I can because he said they're all working. I want to make sure. What happens when we see those people that anger us? You know? What happens when somebody that got that promotion instead of us comes into our life? What happens when we realize that replacement therapy doesn't really work? It's like lighting a fire under the pressure cooker. You see? Every reminder I have brings that all back up again, churns it up in my memory. And every time somebody says these things, thinking that they're helping, all they're doing is helping me to suppress my feelings. And if I don't get rid of these feelings, eventually I'm going to explode. Okay? Now think about this and don't blurt out anybody's name. But have you ever known anybody that went through a significant loss in their life of some sort, and then at some point in time, they just snap? And they say something or they act in a way that's just not like them. Have you ever known anybody that normally is just kind and gentle, and all of a sudden they snap at somebody, or they say something, or they run out, or they do something that's not typical? Guess what's happened? Their little jiggler came loose, right? And what's happening is all of these unresolved issues, unresolved emotional issues, are piling up day after day, year after year, and they weigh heavy on us. To where eventually when we have another major issue that happens and it's all churned up with memories and people are saying don't feel bad and the lid comes down, the pressure's got to go somewhere. Now I'm wanting to tell you a few things here. One, you don't need to listen to people that aren't going to be helpful, and you don't need to be the type of people that say things that aren't helpful, and I know that we don't intend to do that. But if we get rid of those types of things, we don't have the lid. If we don't have the lid, and if we still have the memories, at least things can spill over. But the better choice of action is to forget about some of these things that happened back then, work through them, be healthy, put them away, complete that experience. The little girl who bullied you at recess in kindergarten is probably a grandmother now, and she's got her hands full with other things. She probably doesn't remember you, and you're the only one carrying that memory, and it's causing you grief. The job that you didn't get at your first place of employment, you didn't get that promotion somebody else did, you know, you learned from that experience. You learned to be a better person. You got another job later on because it made you work harder and learn the process. Every challenge we have, just like that emperor moth, is a challenge and a chance for us to learn and to grow and to do better. Jesus didn't have everybody like him. As a matter of fact, enough people hated him that they killed him. And when you go through life thinking that everything has to work out just exactly right, you're going to be disappointed. So that's just an exercise there to help us. Now, the last place here, without completion, our pot will explode, and we won't be healthy in what we're trying to do. All right, well, let's talk a little bit about perspective on loss. Perspective on loss. Now, I think I mentioned to you earlier, I'm a Kentucky fan. So I've been enjoying the ball games for the NCAA tournament, especially when people lose that are on our most hated list or most unloved list, I should say, as a Christian, right? When Kansas lost, that was a great day. When North Carolina lost, that was a great day. I was so disappointed last night that Duke won, but that's all right. They're going to play Louisville next, and whoever loses, I'm happy because I don't like either one of them. But, well, actually, I am kind of pulling for Louisville because I don't want Duke to win anymore. But anyway, perspective on loss. What's the perspective? Last year, Kentucky was winning all the games. They only lost 2 games the whole year. It was like we expected them to win. I was in everything. I mean, I was in a pool with James Hayes, picking the things. And I mean, I was really engaged with it. It was a very important part of my March and April. This year, I couldn't care less at this point. It's a matter of perspective, you see. When you were growing up as young parents and you had children that were in the high school here or the grade school, no doubt you were part of the band parents or PTA or other things. You were very much engaged in the local school. Once your kids got out of that school, though, you weren't nearly as engaged in that school as you were before. Perspectives change things. This first one here. Consider the perspective of a single strikeout in a ball game. A single strikeout in a ball game. You remember that poem about no joy in Mudville, wasn't it? Casey at bat. Casey at the bat, right? He strikes out. No joy in Mudville today, or wherever it was, right? No joy. Well, consider this. I mean, there are a lot of people that are up to the plate the last of the ninth inning down. You're down 3 runs, bases are loaded, full count. You either swing and hit a grand slam and you're a hero, or whatever else ends the game. And if you strike out, that's a very important strikeout. But to put all this in perspective, those guys get millions of dollars for being a failure 70% of the time. If they get a hitter on base 3 out of 10 times, they're considered to be a success. Now, they get millions of dollars. Now, if I go to a heart doctor, what kind of success rate am I going to want him to have? A lot better than 30%, I can tell you that, right? I want him to be successful 99.999%, and already have his mistake done before he gets to me, right? I don't want it being that he's like, well, I'm perfect so far, but you're the 1,000th patient, and for my percentage to work out, it's not going to be good for you, so I'm sorry. No. What kind of perspective does that place on things? I used to follow the Cincinnati Reds and Big Red Machine, and I couldn't, long before internet, the radio was pretty weak, couldn't get it in the house. I'd go out in the car before I could drive, and I'd take Dad's car, and if I drove it around to the back and just on the slight incline, facing a certain way, I could pick up Cincinnati Reds on the radio. And I would stay out there in this car, feeling I was big, and I would listen to Marty Brenneman and Joe Nuxall call that game, and I was with them every step of the game. When the paper came out, I knew all the leaders and all the different things. I knew all that stuff. Today, I couldn't tell you who's on any roster. Perspective changes things. A strikeout, you lost the game, you didn't go to the World Series, or it's the worst meltdown ever. We tend to get over it, don't we? We tend to get over it. The Titans came, three yards away from being Super Bowl champions. Terrible, horrible thing. The sun still came up the next day, and they still sell Titans memorabilia. There's a way for us to look at things with perspective to where we can see that life really does go on. And when I'm ready, life is going to be ready for me. Consider the perspective of losing out on a promotion at work. This happened to me early on when I was working at Nortel Networks, Northern Telecom, as it used to be known. I was working in Atlanta. Kind of fast-tracked, everybody was growing, and the companies and the departments were growing. We were hiring people, and so that usually meant if there was more work, people got promotions pretty easy. And there were a couple times when I thought, this is the job for me, and I'd go in for it, and I'd be all pumped up for it. and then it wouldn't work out. And later on, I had a really good boss. Once I did get a promotion, he said, let me explain to you why you didn't get that earlier promotion and why you're better off now because of what happened. And he started to explain to me about the experience that I was gaining and proving myself and developing my contacts a little bit more fully. I wasn't really ready the first time around when I thought I was, but I stayed with it. I had some encouragement. By the time I got the promotion later on, I was a much better manager once I got into management because I learned those lessons. Think about that as perspective. If you always got everything you wanted, life would be pretty boring. I mean, it really would be. Think about it. Life would be pretty boring if everything fell into place all the time for you every day. Life would be pretty boring. I want you to consider also Caleb Sams. He's a junior at Freed-Hardeman. His dad, Kirk, and I were in college together, and just last August at the Cane Ridge Lectures up in Lexington, Kentucky, there was a picture of 5 of us that had all started school together 32 years before. And anyway, my friend Higginbotham, he conveniently took that. You can see it on my Facebook page somewhere hidden. He took that picture of all 5 of us, took my hair off, put it on Kirk Sams, left me bald, and did some other things with other people. He thinks he's good at Facebook. He's okay, It's not passable. But I will tell you, when I did a meeting for him in Glasgow, Kentucky a few years ago, I walked into the basement entrance of the church building, looked over on the bulletin board, and there's a big 8x10 advertisement for the meeting, and I'm bald in it. I didn't know if he really sent it out to other churches or just put it on that one bulletin board, but there it was. I'm not bald. It's real. It's there. It's thick. But Caleb Sams is a great guy, and his mom and dad have been involved with the church all their lives, brought up wonderful kids. Kirk, his dad, is a preacher. He's heavily involved in one of the youth camps in North Carolina. Caleb started having trouble with his left leg. The doctors kept saying it's a tendonitis or something else. Kept going back for tests. Come to find out it's a very aggressive form of cancer. It's a rare cancer that he's got. It's in his lung as well. So they told Caleb, who's an athlete, now your leg is in trouble. We're going to try to save your leg, but we're not sure if we can. Here are the treatments that you're going to have to endure. And if we can't save the leg, then we'll have to cut it off, but that'll likely save your life if we do that. A few things happen as they're starting the treatment, and then they decide we're definitely going to have to take off part of your leg, but these treatments are still going to set you back some. Caleb's attitude was phenomenal. I mean, outstanding. I mean, if you came to me and I'm 20 years old, you say, look, you love to run and play sports, and here's an injury that's going to change your life from now on. You're never going to be able to run again. I'm going to be devastated. You know what Caleb's outlook was? He said, I'm sorry I got the cancer. I can't do anything about that except to try to treat it. But, I'm kind of glad that they're going to have to take my leg off. Because if they could save my leg and save my life both, my leg is going to be so weak I'd never be able to run on it. But they've got those neat things that you can put on now. They can cut my leg off, and in a few months they'll fit me with a blade or with something else, and I'll be able to run. I might even be able to run faster than other people. Now, how's that for an attitude to face a loss? I've looked around. I don't see anybody here with just one leg. I've got a good friend up in Kentucky that's got one arm. His name is Arlie Critton, and he works at the Youngblood's True Value store up there. He's a wonderful guy who used to be where I preached, and Arlie could help you with anything. And you go, and here he goes, picking this box out and doing all this stuff. He's learned to live with one arm his whole life. He adapts to that. I've known some other people that say, I've got diabetes. I can't do anything the rest of my life. Or I've lost my hearing, or I've lost my sense of this, and so my life is over. I could fill another 3 hours. I won't, but I could fill another 3 hours talking about people I know who have overcome problems in life, and they stand out in another aspect of their life in a very inspirational way. One lady where I preached in Nashville years ago, she had polio as a child. It crippled her. She cared for her parents who died. She had a husband she cared for who later died. When I came into her life and got to know her, she was in a wheelchair. She was still coming to church. And then eventually she got to where she couldn't go out anytime except just go to the doctor. She sat at home. She was better than any phone tree message system that we had because if there was news that had to get out, we would call her and boom, boom, boom. She called certain key people who knew to call other people, and that news was out. the elders bought boxes of cards and postage stamps for her, and she wrote notes to so many people every week, encouraging them, thinking of you, get well, sympathy, and she did that on behalf of the church. Ann was her name, and Ann embraced the difficulties in her life. All of her life she'd been set back on physical issues. All of her life she'd been beset by all kinds of shortages in her relationships and in life. Life just hadn't treated her well. And all of her life, Ann faced every situation by saying, you know, I think there's still something I can do. And until the day she died, she was still trying to find ways, how can I help? How can I be an influence on other people? Our loss needs to be put in perspective of the big picture. I know I've given some personal examples, but that's to keep Matthew from stealing them later and telling them as his own. Now, one more on perspective of loss, and this is telling bad on me. When I was in college, I had a car, and I loved this car. It was a 1972 Chevy Malibu. Not like a Chevelle SS, but close enough, okay? It was midnight bronze. It had two big white racing stripes down the hood and the trunk. Your typical preacher's son car, okay? I love that car. I love that car. One night I was home and a drunk pulled out in front of me in Paducah, and I hit him, and I had to have the car worked on. They straightened out the frame. They had to replace the hood, had to repaint it and stuff. All my life was just in tatters. My life was over because I was on campus without a car. I was just nobody. And finally, I went home one weekend, and that car was ready. I was so happy. The Harlem Globetrotters were playing a game at Paducah Tillman High School. And so our family was going up there. And so I went by, and I've got the car now, and we're at the game. And later, my baby sister, Debbie, who was about, well, let's see, I would have been 18, 19. She would have been about 10 years old at the time. So she's riding with me back home, and my parents are going a different way. I'm sitting in an intersection. Let me just draw it out for you since I've got these wonderful markers, right? Here's an intersection right here, okay? This is where I am right here, and a couple of cars back behind me, right? Now, I'm sitting right here minding my own business, and in this intersection here, this one car goes and veers, and this car, you know, something happens, they drop their coffee or something. They have a major head-on collision right in front of me. And one car comes and lands on my hood. I was not happy. I hit that steering wheel. I can still remember the feeling because they weren't padded steering wheels. I hit that steering wheel so hard, I turned off my keys. I got out, I slammed my door, and I came over, and I'm looking at my hood. Now, what am I doing wrong? Where are my priorities? They've just had a wreck in front of me. They're still in their car. I don't know if they're alive, bleeding, or dead, or what. They're right here. And I look back later, and here are the people from these cars. They've come out to rescue my sister, who was a passenger in my car, to see if she's okay. How big do you think I felt? About negative infinities. I didn't feel good at all. Now, what was wrong with this whole picture, okay? My priorities were definitely off because my life was wrapped up in this car. That's what I really, really loved, okay? It was replacement therapy so I could get a girlfriend where I could really, really love her, right? But I really, really loved this car. And I was so happy to have this car back. But my priorities needed to be realigned. But being a teenager at college, it doesn't come easy for me to learn any lessons from people who know better. And so here were my priorities. My car, my car, my car. I didn't think about the other people that had the wreck in front. I didn't think about my own sister in the car. I was totally focused on me. Now, I had sat in that dorm room many nights thinking, I could be driving now if I had a car. Poor, pitiful me. And how happy I was to get that car back, and then just like that, it was taken away from me again. Our loss needs to have proper perspective. Now, every loss and every grief experience, you're going to experience it up to its full value. And I can tell you this, losing a car, losing a pet, moving and losing your friends, missing out on a promotion at work, having a relationship to go bad, experiencing a divorce, experiencing the death of a child, experiencing a miscarriage, experiencing the death of your spouse or your parents or anyone else. All of those are real loss situations. They're really loss situations. And you're going to experience a level of grief with each and every one of them. The key for me for moving beyond such losses is to eventually put it all in perspective. I don't know still who was in the cars. They were okay. My sister was okay too, although every now and then she says, my neck hurts a little bit. Would you get up and get me something to drink? It's all a matter of perspective. Yes, there are some things that seem like the end of the world. But if I'm a Christian, if it's the end of my world, that's okay. Because that's a part of perspective as well. You see? If I'm right with God, there's nothing that this world can do to me that can take my relationship with God away. If I'm right with God and He's got a home prepared for me in heaven, no matter what happens to me now, there's going to be a moment when I open my eyes and I will think, what took me so long to get here? Why did I want to hang on so long to what was causing me so much trouble? In Isaiah 53 and verse 3, it says that, talking of Jesus here, that He is a man of sorrows. Isaiah chapter 41 and verse 10, and I do want to read that. I'm not going to read all these because I've run out of time. But in 41 and verse 10, fear not, for I am with you. Be not dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you. Yes, I will help you. I will uphold you with my righteous right hand. Man of sorrows, help is coming. I believe that God is wanting to help us. He's helping us in multiple ways. He helps us with His wonderful family around us to support us and encourage us. In Hebrews 4, verses 15 and 16, we're told the following. He says, for we do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weaknesses, but was in all points tempted as we are, yet without sin. Let us therefore come boldly to the throne of grace that we may obtain mercy and find grace to help in time of need. We need to know that Jesus cares for us. He suffered so much here. He knows how we are in pain and anguish, and He wants us to be right with Him. In this next section on 1 Thessalonians chapter 3, this passage, we won't read the whole thing, but it starts out by saying that we don't need to be ignorant. Don't be ignorant of the facts. But I do not want you to be ignorant, brethren, concerning those who have fallen asleep, lest you sorrow as others who have no hope. For if we believe that Jesus died and rose again, even so God will bring with Him those who sleep in Jesus. That's my timer saying I need to quit. So that means I got 10 more minutes. Not really. The end of that passage, look what he says in verse 18. Therefore comfort one another with these words. See, Paul's telling people who are worried about, well, now, my wife, my cousin, my grandmother, they died before Jesus came again. They're going to miss out on all the glory of seeing Jesus come again. And he says, don't worry about those things because it's not going to matter. Don't worry about those things because when Jesus comes again, He's going to bring with Him those who have died. The dead in Christ are going to rise first, and we're going to meet Him in the air. And you need to comfort each other with these words. You've not lost out on anything. In Romans chapter 8 and verse 18, we were in Romans 8 before in verse 28 about all things working together for good. In verse 18 he says the following, for I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory which shall be revealed in us. There are many things that we suffer in this life. And we get to a point eventually where we realize what God's been trying to tell us all along. All the things that we endure, all the things that we struggle with, all the things that really make us stronger, strengthen our faith in God, cause us to grow, cause us to yearn for Him and search for Him, all of those things do make us stronger. They do make us more faithful. They do give us more confidence and assurance of the future. In Matthew chapter 5 and verse 4 is a part of the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus speaks there and He says, blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Mourning is expected. Mourning is to be tended to. Jesus wept. Jesus mourned, not because Lazarus was dead. Jesus surveyed the audience that was there. He saw the hurt in Martha and Mary. He saw the anguish and the grief with everyone, and He wept. He shared in their sorrows. In Psalm 119 and verse 50, Let me get over here. This is my comfort in my affliction, for your word has given me life. Somebody last night was telling me about a lady who had read through the Bible multiple times once she knew that she had an illness, and had gained strength from that. Many times when we go to do a funeral, we'll ask for the person's Bible, and we'll see certain passages that are marked and notes written in the margins and things that are there. Oftentimes there will be familiar passages that the family knows about that were a particular comfort to mom or dad or whoever else was there. And these are all helpful to us. Now I want us to just share very quickly one of my favorite passages. It's in the Psalms, Psalm 27 and verse 1. The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the strength of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid? It comes down to perspective again, not to shortchange anything that we've suffered as a loss. But when my dad died, he was 58, it wasn't a fair situation. There may have been some things that could have been done differently that could have saved his life. There were lots of thoughts about blame and issues and guilt and all these things that came crashing in. But the reality was that he was gone, and we were going to have to deal with life without him. And it took some time, along with other things. And we learned a lot of lessons in that struggle. First of all, we learned that we really didn't understand what real grief was, because we had tended to others but not really suffered in the way of losing a spouse or a parent. And it was really difficult. But there comes a time when you do realize, I can be complete, I can go on. Now this last passage I'm not going to read, but in Philippians 3, Paul talks about of the things that he's at in life. He says, forgetting those things that are behind, I press toward the goal. Now remember we had BC and AD on the chart. Before Christ and in the year of our Lord. Anno Domini, or something like that. Axel Domino, something along that line, right? We marked time by a loss that occurred. There are times for us to know that we can mark time by a loss that occurs too, but the key is to put it in perspective, to deal with it and complete it, and to be ready to continue living. This is the land of the living, not the land of the dead. And I believe that God provides us with so many tools with which we can use. Well, listen, we've covered a lot of material in 2 different sessions. I teach a class that goes on for 10 weeks. I couldn't use all of that even if I wanted to in 2 different settings. And I hope that some of what we've covered has been helpful to you and to let you know that there is hope. All of you have suffered loss in one way or the other and will suffer losses in the future. The more that we educate one another about the fact that loss is real, there's no guilt that goes along with loss, but there is a real pain of grief that goes along with it. The more sensitive we can be to one another's needs, the more opportunity we have to knowing that we can do what God needs us to do. We are family. God has provided us with this family, and we need to lean and rely on our family as we go forward. Thank you so much for your attention. Matthew.